Philadelphia, June 1787. The summer heat was unbearable, the kind of heat that makes men short-tempered, impatient, and angry. And inside a single room in Independence Hall, 55 men had been arguing for weeks. Not just arguing, fighting, threatening, preparing to walk out and go home. These were not ordinary men. These were the greatest legal and political minds the American colonies had ever produced. George Washington sat at the front of the room, tall and silent, watching. James Madison took notes with trembling hands. Alexander Hamilton paced the floor. These men had already done the impossible. They had defeated the most powerful empire on earth. They had won a war that no one believed they could win. And yet here they were in the summer of 1787, losing. Not to a foreign army, not to British soldiers, they were losing to each other. The dream of a united America, one nation under God, was crumbling right before their eyes. And then an old man stood up. He was 81 years old. His body was frail. Every morning he had to be carried to the convention in a sedan chair because he could no longer walk the distance. His name was Benjamin Franklin, and what he said next changed everything. Stay with me, because what happens in this story is something every American needs to hear. This is the moment they never taught you in school. This is the story of the prayer that built a nation. This is the story of the day God showed up in the most important room in American history. To understand what was happening in that room, you have to go back. You have to understand what these men had already been through. Just 4 years before this moment, America had been a battlefield. British warships had blockaded the ports. British soldiers had burned the farms. British courts had tried to crush the spirit of every man, woman, and child in the colonies. And yet they had won. Against all odds, against all reason, against every calculation made by every general and every king in Europe, the American colonies had won their independence. But the road to that victory had been soaked in suffering. Washington's army had barely survived the winter at Valley Forge. Men had no shoes. They wrapped their bleeding feet in rags. They starved. They froze. The temperature dropped so far below zero that the Delaware River turned to ice. Soldiers died in their sleep. Others deserted. The Continental Army was falling apart. George Washington himself, the same man now sitting silently at the front of this room, had written in a letter during those darkest days that he had almost ceased to hope. Almost, but not completely, because in those frozen fields men had prayed. Washington had prayed on his knees in the snow at Valley Forge, and history recorded what happened next. They survived, they endured, they came back from the edge of total collapse, and they won. Now it was 1787. The war was over. America was free. But freedom, it turned out, was only the beginning of the fight. 13 separate states were behaving like 13 separate countries. Each one had its own laws, its own currency, its own armies, its own interests. Merchants were fighting merchants. Borders were in dispute. Debts were piling up. Foreign nations watched from across the ocean and whispered to each other that this experiment called America would not survive another 10 years. Even some Americans believed it. Someone had to fix it. Someone had to create a framework, a constitution that would hold this fragile new nation together. And so they gathered, the most remarkable collection of minds in American history, in one room, in Philadelphia, in the sweltering summer of 1787. James Madison, just 36 years old, had spent months preparing. He arrived in Philadelphia with an entire plan already written, a detailed vision for a new government. George Washington brought his towering moral authority. Just by being in the room, Washington made men believe that something great was possible. Alexander Hamilton argued brilliantly and tirelessly for a strong central government. And Benjamin Franklin, the oldest man in the room, the most famous American in the entire world, the man who had charmed the kings of Europe and pulled lightning from the sky, was there too. At 81 years old, he still had something to say. But weeks into the convention, everything had gone wrong. The debate over representation had reached a complete and total deadlock. Large states wanted the number of votes each state received to be based on population. Small states refused. They wanted every state to have an equal voice, regardless of size. Neither side would budge. Without agreement on this single issue, there could be no constitution. And without a constitution, there was no United States of America. There was only 13 small, quarreling countries that would eventually be swallowed up by European empires. Delegates from New York were preparing to leave. Others had already threatened to walk out. The entire convention was on the verge of complete collapse. It was the morning of June 28, 1787. And that is when the old man stood up. Benjamin Franklin rose from his chair slowly. The room began to quiet down. Men who had been arguing stopped mid-sentence. There was something in the way he moved, something in the look on his face that made everyone stop and pay attention. He cleared his throat and began to speak. He said, "In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers were heard, and they were graciously answered." The room went completely silent. He continued. He said, "All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity." Men who had been red-faced and furious just minutes before were now completely still. Franklin looked around the room. He looked at Madison, at Hamilton, at Washington. And then he asked the question that cut through every argument, every ego, every political calculation in that hall. He said, "And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance?" Nobody answered, because there was no good answer. They had forgotten. In the heat of the debate, in the pride of their own intelligence and education and ambition, they had forgotten. Franklin kept going. He said, "I have lived a long time, sir, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? Let that land for a moment. A sparrow cannot fall to the ground without God's notice, and these men were trying to build an empire without asking for his help." Franklin was not finished. He said, "We have been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel." He then made his proposal. He asked that from that day forward, before every single session of the convention, a pastor would be brought in to lead the delegates in prayer. That these men, the founders of a nation, would begin each morning by bowing before God and asking for wisdom before they dared to reshape the world. And then Benjamin Franklin sat down. The room was completely silent. Even the sounds of the Philadelphia streets outside seemed to fade away. One of the delegates who was present that day later described the moment in a letter to his family. He wrote that when Franklin finished speaking, the room felt different. He wrote that it felt, somehow, like the walls themselves had grown larger. Now, the history books will tell you that Franklin's motion for prayer was not officially adopted. The convention had no funds to pay a chaplain. Some delegates worried that calling for prayer would signal to the public that the convention was in serious trouble. The motion did not pass. But those who were there said something had shifted. The days that followed were different, more respectful, more careful. Men who had been shouting at each other began to listen. Men who had been posturing for political advantage began to look for common ground. The spirit in the room had changed. Something had moved. On July the 4th, 1787, the 11th anniversary of American independence, the entire convention paused. They went to attend a church service in Philadelphia together. A pastor prayed over the delegates. He prayed that God would give them wisdom and unity and the courage to build something that would stand the test of time. Something did change after that. Within weeks, a delegate from Connecticut named Roger Sherman proposed what would become known as the Great Compromise. Large states would have representation based on population in one chamber of Congress, and every state, large or small, would have equal representation in the other. It was the solution, the only solution that could have held the nation together, and it worked. On September the 17th, 1787, the Constitution of the United States of America was signed. 39 men put their names on that document. They were not perfect men. They were flawed, complicated, contradictory men, just like all men. But in that room, at that moment, they built something no nation had ever built before. A government designed to protect the liberty of every citizen. A framework built on the belief that all people are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. A constitution that has now endured for nearly 250 years. James Madison, who is called the father of the Constitution, later wrote about what had happened in that room. He said that there were moments during the convention when the outcome seemed completely impossible. He said that without some guidance greater than what was present in that room, he could not explain how they had succeeded. Benjamin Franklin agreed. In his final years, he told those close to him that he had seen the hand of God move in Philadelphia. He had no other explanation. Now I want to stop and speak directly to you. When you look at this country, when you look at what was built in that summer of 1787, do you believe it was an accident? Do you believe that 55 men who hated each other's positions, who represented 13 competing states with 13 sets of conflicting interests, just happened to find the perfect solution at the exact moment when everything was falling apart? These men had every reason to fail, and yet they did not fail. An 81-year-old man, frail, carried to meetings every morning in a chair, stood up at the exact moment when everything was collapsing. And he reminded a room full of the most educated men in America of the most important truth in the universe. God governs in the affairs of men. Not presidents, not senators, not armies or trade agreements or political strategies. God governs. And the men in that room heard it, and something moved, something that cannot be explained by political science or historical analysis, something that can only be explained by faith. Your founding fathers were not perfect men. They made mistakes that history rightly remembers and judges. But in their finest moment, they did what all great Americans have done throughout the history of this country. In the frozen fields of Valley Forge, on the beaches of Normandy, in the hospitals of Korea, in the rubble of September the 11th, in the darkest moments of this nation's life, Americans have always done the same thing. They looked up, they prayed, and God answered. That is your inheritance, not just a constitution, not just a flag, a covenant, a promise made in a sweltering room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 by men who believed with everything in them that a nation built on faith could not be broken. Do you believe that too? I think you do. I think that is why you are here listening to this story, because somewhere deep in your heart you already know it, you already feel it. America was not built by chance. America was built by faith. If this story moved you, share it. Send it to your children. Send it to your grandchildren. Send it to anyone in your life who needs to be reminded of where this country came from. Because there is a generation growing up right now that has never heard this story. They have never been told about the old man who stood up when everything was falling apart. They have never heard his words, and they need to hear them. God governs in the affairs of men. Those words were true in 1787. They were true at Valley Forge. They were true at Normandy. And they are true today. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, stories of faith, courage, and the God who has watched over this nation since the very beginning, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss one. And leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. Do you believe God still governs in the affairs of men? Tell me what you think. God bless you, and God bless America.